Vietnam and South Korea strengthen economic ties. Vietnam's IT startup landscape. Hello and welcome to Bizline, brought to you by VTV International. You're with me, Ling Hung, and as usual, we'll start with several highlights in the economic scene for the past week. Party General Secretary Nguyễn Phú Trọng arrived in Seoul on October 1st, beginning his 4-day state visit to the Republic of Korea. On this occasion, Trọng emphasized that Vietnam will continue to create more favorable conditions to support Korean enterprises with investment in Vietnam, such as Samsung and Kyangn. Trọng witnessed the permit granting ceremony that allows Samsung to build a $1.4 billion factory in the Ho Chi Minh City High-Tech Industrial Park. Earlier at a meeting with representatives from other Korean firms, he encouraged Korean enterprises to invest on infrastructure, green growth, supported technology, and training future personnel. Vietnam and Korea aim to bring two-way trade turnover to $70 billion by 2020 and finish negotiations for Vietnam-South Korea FTA by year-end. Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng chaired the government's September cabinet meeting in Hanoi on September 29th. Reviewing socio-economic development for the past 9 months, the cabinet agreed that even though GDP growth surpassed expectations, more efforts need to be made to improve production and national competitiveness. GDP growth since the beginning of this year reached 5.62%, much higher than the same period in the 2 previous years. Prime Minister Dũng proposed that cabinet members come up with solutions to raise credit growth to 12 to 14% by year's end, as well as to solve bad debts and restructure state-owned enterprises effectively. The 11th Annual Asia-Pacific Tax Forum kicked off on October 1st in Hanoi, attracting representatives from over 20 countries. The 3-day event was held by the International Tax and Investment Center in association with Vietnam's Ministry of Finance. This year's forum concentrates on ways to adjust tax payment for businesses in order to leave them more resources to reorganize operations. As many countries in the region continue their strong economic growth, the tax forum this year provides a convenient platform to gain insights into these issues faced and options available in more advanced economies. There are 5,742 enterprises established across the nation during September, with total registered capital of over $1.44 billion, an increase of 13.7% in the number of enterprises and 11.7% in the registered capital compared to August. Reports on the status of business registration in the last 9 months by the agency also revealed that some sectors, including electricity, water, and gas manufacturing and distribution, tend to attract better development, with the number of newly registered businesses rising by 14%, while those dissolving or suspending operations decreased by 26.1% year-on-year. A seminar introducing the new air route from Vietnam's Phu Quoc Island to Singapore and other business opportunities on the island took place on Tuesday in Singapore. The event was organized by the Singaporean branch of Vietnam Airlines, together with authorities of the southern province of Kiên Giang and Vinpearl Resort Phu Quoc. Singapore is currently the 3rd largest foreign investor into Vietnam. Phu Quoc authorities stated that more policies are being established to better support foreign investors in the region. 2 3-hour return flights per week between Singapore and Phu Quoc Island will begin operating from November 2nd. We've just reviewed several highlights in the economic scene for the past week. Up next, we'll discuss Vietnam's IT startup landscape in our crosstalk. Information technology has been identified as one of the sectors that will spearhead Vietnam's economic growth and improve its competitiveness. For Vietnam, cultivating a tech startup scene now represents a potential step up from being an offshore manufacturing hub to a major player in the global digital world. For the past few years, Vietnam has emerged as a rising hub for tech startup companies. In this week's Crosstalk, let's explore what roles these companies are playing in this emerging economy and what are needed to foster these businesses in the long run. Our guest today is Bobby Liu, founder of Hub IT, an incubator and co-working space in Hanoi. But before we begin, let's get a glimpse of Vietnam's startup scene through two startup companies in two different sectors and with different use of technology. The small office is a typical workplace for a newly established business, commonly known as startup. Ticketbox, an event ticketing service, has been around since 2011. Then known as Kiwi, it won the first ever Startup Weekend contest in Ho Chi Minh City.
Thì mới đầu thì cái ý tưởng của mình không phải là một cái ý tưởng về phân phối vé, mà mình chỉ là một cái app để giúp cho cái việc networking ở trên điện thoại. Thì khi mà mình làm những việc đó thì người tổ chức sự kiện thì họ cũng không quan tâm về cái việc là giúp khách hàng networking, mà họ có một cái mối quan tâm lớn hơn, tức là việc phân phối vé, quảng bá event để cho càng nhiều người đến tham dự event càng tốt.
Logging on to Ticketbox website, users can learn about upcoming events and purchase tickets with their credit cards. Easy and convenient, the website had processed 100,000 tickets as of last July.
Đối với lại hình thức phân phối vé truyền thống thì nhà tổ chức sự kiện thì thường họ phải đưa cho nhiều đại lý bán vé khác nhau, thì thường rất là khó để họ kiểm soát được số lượng vé bán được theo thời gian thật. Thì còn rất là khó để cho họ gọi là thu thập thông tin của khách hàng khi mà một người khách hàng đã mua vé. Thì đối với lại cái hệ thống online thì bây giờ ban tổ chức chỉ cần đăng thông tin lên website thôi.
Mike is currently working to integrate seat maps onto his website. This will give Ticketbox a competitive edge compared to the traditional ticketing service. Mike predicts the new companies with similar idea may emerge, but Ticketbox will always have the advantage of being among the first in Vietnam. This quite larger office is the new home of Synetics, among the first consultancy companies to utilize the Building Information System, or BIM, in construction projects in Vietnam. BIM provides 3D visualization and integrates electromechanical information of building projects, thus reducing construction and maintenance waste.
Công ty Synetics được thành lập khoảng 3 năm trước với mục đích là mang lại cái tính liên kết cho nhà thầu, chủ đầu tư và các công ty thiết kế nhằm có thể liên kết với nhau thông qua một nguồn thông tin chung để từ đó có thể tăng năng suất lao động và tăng hiệu quả trong việc đầu tư.
BIM is new to many developed countries. The US, Norway and Finland, for instance, require all construction projects using state budgets to apply BIM to manage cost. However, BIM is relatively new to Vietnam, which has both pros and cons for the startup.
Trong thời gian đầu rất khó để có được niềm tin đối với tất cả những công ty khách hàng, tại vì phần lớn những công ty khách hàng thuê là dịch vụ Synetics là những công ty họ đã có ít nhất là 20 năm cho tới ít nhất là 20 năm đã có mặt trên thị trường. Cho nên cái việc mà mình thuyết phục những người khách hàng lâu đời như vậy rất là khó để cho họ chuyển đổi từ việc là tự build một team trong công ty họ để họ chuyển qua một cái hình thức khác là họ sẽ outsource, họ sẽ đưa ra những cái dịch vụ đó để bên mình cung cấp từ một công ty ngoài.
The co-founder shares that Vietnamese authorities are working on a roadmap to adopt BIM as a standard for construction projects, and this is promised to open up greater opportunities for BIM and Synetics. Bobby Liu, it's a pleasure to have you with us in our show today.
It's my pleasure.
So with your experience of building businesses in the United States and several other countries, could you tell us about the startup scene in the world right now, and particularly Southeast Asian countries?
Obviously, the entire tech scene is led by Silicon Valley. They're considered there as the mecca of innovation. Lots of very high valuation startups come from there. Some of the names I'm sure you know, and some of the applications that you're probably even using, WhatsApp, Snapchat, for example. All these innovations have, in the last few years, trickled down to Southeast Asia, given that Asians, by and large, in the last 10, 15 years or so, have actually lived or studied or lived abroad, in the US particularly, and sort of be influenced by the culture of startup. And a lot of all these people, particularly in Vietnam, that bring all this culture back here. I think Vietnamese by nature are very entrepreneurial. So this whole startup ecosystem or this whole startup scene sort of fits into the kind of nature that they already have.
So how does Vietnam startup scene look like, and how attractive is Vietnam as a hub for tech startup?
It is still at its infancy, still very early stage. Particularly if you compare to other ASEAN countries like Singapore, Thailand, or even Indonesia. Vietnam is sort of a few steps behind, not too far. The good thing is most of the pioneers in the startup scene here actually have connection to other ASEAN countries or further abroad. I got to look at ASEAN as an entire region of tech hub, not just Vietnam or Thailand or Singapore. By geographic divide, these countries are part of a bloc called ASEAN, which we are actually next year we are entering into the AEC. That creates a lot of momentum. That creates a lot of collaborative potential. And if I have to pick one major advantage that Vietnam has, it is the talent pool, right? Okay, so we all know that Singapore has the money. That's where all the VCs are, and whatever all the deal making. Okay, and then from the early stage, money has been going to like Indonesia, Thailand. Okay, where else next? Okay, we look at Vietnam. Actually, future startups or potential startups down the line will look at Vietnam and say, hey, why don't we make Vietnam as the center of innovation? Why don't we make Vietnam to be the prototyping ground? First of all, if we all believe that innovation is borderless, so what's so bad about coming to Vietnam to live for 6 months, get something, work with the local developers, and the upside is, Vietnam has a population of near 100 million, and you're talking about two major cities, Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, having total population of more than 20 million, urban population. You don't get that in other ASEAN countries.
Right. So what are the advantages of setting up a tech startup in Vietnam at the moment?
Apart from the huge talent pool, comparatively speaking, the cost of hiring is at the moment still relatively low compared to other more developed cities. Great living condition, I think. You've got a population of, like 50% of population below the age of 35, fairly mobile, high literacy rate.
So what are the downsides of running a tech startup in Vietnam now?
If you are involved in some kind of online payment thing, payment gateway here is not very strong. Regulation is not favorable. For example, if you work with telco, the rates are very high. If they're able to adjust that, I think you're going to see a lot more people using the platform.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the types of startup businesses that have been growing in Vietnam currently?
Mainly in Vietnam, if you really look at it, e-commerce is not so much. It's not taking off so much simply because of payment gateway issues. But people are working around it. Vietnamese are resilient people. They find ways to get around to doing things. For the main push within, let's say, the startup ecosystem, I think it's more a mobile play.
VC Corp was among the first IT startups in Vietnam in mid-2000s and has become a big name in Vietnam's tech industry. The company manages a huge portfolio of internet properties that span online content, e-commerce, social media, ad networks, and even food delivery. VC Corp's co-founder Nguyễn Thế Tân shares that it's now easier to launch an IT business.
Mở một doanh nghiệp khởi nghiệp công nghệ thì nó dễ hơn rất nhiều, bởi vì là cơ hội nó rộng hơn, nó có xã hội hồi xưa rất ít thứ, bây giờ là nhiều thứ, nào web, nào mobile, rồi game, rồi thế giới, nó rất nhiều ý tưởng để mình có thể mình làm. Đấy. Cái thứ hai là cái chi phí về mặt chi phí công nghệ nó rẻ, hồi xưa mình làm bằng triệu đô, bây giờ thì tốn khoảng 1/10 rồi, rồi nhân sự nó cũng đa dạng hơn.
However, since it's easier to open a startup, competition is getting fiercer. To succeed, companies have to be versatile.
Để mà làm thành công ấy, thì ngoài cái việc là mình đi trước đi nhanh, thì mình những cái doanh nghiệp khởi nghiệp nó phải có ý tưởng riêng, phải có ý tưởng riêng mà phải làm hiểu rất sâu sắc. Chứ làm đơn giản và hời hợt thì sẽ không được.
According to Anh Minh Do, who covers Vietnam startup scene for Tech in Asia, besides VC Corp, VNG and Vietza were notable IT firms during the first wave of startups in Vietnam in mid-2000s. all of these firms were invested by IDG Venture, the first technology venture capital fund in the country with $100 million under management.
But at that time, it's like Wild West. Nobody knew anything about how to do startup, how to make money in Vietnam. And there's only about 3 million users online, right? And now it's like more than 36 million, maybe 40 million by the end of this year. And now, 10 years later, it's much more mature, right? There's much more founders who've made it, many more people who have been in a big company or a big startup, and now they are starting their own, or they are working with a younger startup. And so it's a little more mature now than it was before. But at the same time, maybe less realistic. Maybe there's a lot more hype, right? A lot more people who see startup and khởi nghiệp as like trendy in Vietnam. But that doesn't mean they know what it takes, or that doesn't mean that they will survive the next wave, right?
Still, there is a promising landscape for Vietnamese startups now, as quite a few investors are actively looking for tech startups to invest in. One such investor is DFJ Vina Capital, a $32 million venture capital fund co-managed by Vina Capital and Drip official Druvason.
So far, we have invested in about 10 companies. Our average size of investment is between around $1 million, $1.5 million. The company that we have invested the most in is $5 million, and we can go anywhere from a few $100,000 to a few $1 million.
DFJ Vina Capital generally invests in later-stage IT startups in telecommunication, online recruiting, and digital advertising. The firm is now raising its second fund and expresses interest in technology startups. Could you name some of the successful startups in Vietnam?
If you look at historical records, you've got pretty good ones like Apple, which is like considered the app store for Vietnam. They are doing well not just locally, but they're doing very well in terms of the attention that they're getting from investors. And from there, they are able to spin off different things, which recently I think they have developed this social gaming platform called OnClan, which is actually making some noise within the sector. And then, of course, you have MWorks, who's also more in gaming, but also in payment. The solution that they are providing actually allows a lot of gamers to monetize on it. Well, I guess one of the superstar, and it would be Gringar, where they developed this collaborative whiteboard application based in Saigon. The founder has now gone on to develop other startups.
What makes them successful?
Well, fresh idea, a need in the market, founders, belief. A lot of times, it's just this, I would say, blind belief. And most importantly, of course, by nature, the entrepreneurial spirit that, is in Vietnamese.
How about the startup ideas and startup businesses that fail? What are usually the reasons?
Why they fail? Market traction, a lot of times. Not able to get a big enough market to continue on. When you don't get a big enough market, for example, adoption market, then you obviously don't seem so interesting to investors. Hence, they're not able to get investment. Running out of money, obviously. You do have successful, or so-called invested startups that fail because maybe founders, they fight with each other. Running a company is very different from having a great idea and building something. You could get a great mechanic, to do up your car or your motorbike. Okay, but this mechanic will not be able to run the workshop. Startups now realize, the kind of roles that they need to play within the scope of work that they do. So founders may not be CEO, and they have to look outside to find somebody that can actually manage the team and make the team grow.
Now let's talk more about funding. Who and what type of organizations are most interested in investing in Vietnamese startups?
Venture capital here. They've been set up for the last 5 to 8 years. IDG, VNG, who came from basically a startup and now they are a VC. Then you have from Japan, Cyber Agent that has an office here in Hanoi as well as in Ho Chi Minh City. And then further afield, you get people like Golden Gate Ventures from out of Singapore, who is paying a lot of attention into Vietnam. Simply, I think, they see jewels that other people are not seeing. I would say outside of Vietnam, people that are paying attention to Vietnam's startup scene, from the VCs are from Singapore and Japan.
What do startups need to do to attract other types of investment?
Based on whatever idea that they have, they need to try to do a bit more research, substantial research into the background of the idea. And research is not just about giving them the data to validate the idea. The research basically show to actually give them the vision of how big it can be.
Incubators and universities are a very important part of the whole ecosystem for startups. Do incubators and universities in Vietnam have had a good impact on the startup scene?
Yes, definitely. Good, relative, but definitely positive. 2 years ago, I meet startups that have no idea of startups, and to me, I'm looking at it from the point of you having an idea or vision as a business, not as a project, or competition. So throughout the last 24 months, I've seen a shift in people sort of understanding that, and that's very important because with that vision comes, a viable business model that can be that investors will be interested in, and from there you can only improve. Rather than you have a vision and say, I don't know how to make money, and that's not going to, interest investors. It's okay if your family has a lot of money and you do it on your own, okay, but that's, far and few in between. Most times, startups, are people with, are dreamers who are trying to build something. And yes, definitely incubators, universities, have positive impact on that.
Recently, there have been some organizations that have paved the way for the new startups to grow. One of the organizations is called FIRST, a partnership between Ministry of Science and Technology and World Bank. Let's take a look. This is a regular meeting between World Bank representatives and the personnel at FIRST, which stands for Fostering Innovations Through Research, Science and Technology. Startup businesses are among the beneficiaries of FIRST.
Startups form a very important part of the ecosystem for innovation, together with universities, with research institutions and with existing enterprises which are doing research and development. The first project will provide grants to research institutes. So some of those research institutes, professors there, students there, people who are affiliated with those institutes may want to set up a startup company and they will benefit from that. We have other kinds of grants. Some of them are direct grants, some of them are matching grants.
Launched in 2014, the 5-year project is worth $110 million, including $100 million worth of preferential loans from the World Bank and $10 million of Vietnamese government. FIRST is responsible for organizing networking events and skill training workshops for the startup community. According to FIRST, the Ministry of Science and Technology is developing a legal framework to develop favorable policies for startups, such as tax exemptions and reductions.
Chính phủ đang nghiên cứu một cách kỹ lưỡng về cái việc mà thành lập một quỹ đầu tư mạo hiểm ở Việt Nam. Quỹ đầu tư mạo hiểm này đã quy định trong luật công nghệ cao rồi. Vấn đề chỉ là đang bàn cách thức để thành lập cái quỹ này như thế nào thôi. Và khi quỹ này ra đời thì được kỳ vọng như là một cú hích cho cái cộng đồng startup Việt Nam phát triển.
How do you assess the government's efforts to foster the development of startups right now?
It's great. If they're taking an example of what Singapore has done or what Thailand has done, where the telco actually supported startups, I think the Ministry of Science and Technology with the World Bank have actually taken a big leap forward. How can they help? By and large, it's great to have grants, funding, okay, but I don't think that's the more important thing. I think through their influence, within the government department, basically, I'm hoping that they're able to make things easier, open up more doors, into other departments, making things more streamlined instead of being more difficult. At the same time, they are able to work with their fellow counterparts in other countries to create, collaboration, to create some cooperation that typically what ASEAN nations are doing anyways. So I think, just even from that aspect, without even the investment component, I think that in itself is a big jump forward.
So what do you think about the prospects of Vietnamese startups in the next 10 or 15 years?
10, 15 years, fantastic. Critically, maybe you should really think about the next 3 years, because I consider that as a window. Other countries, okay, first of all, programmers, developers, okay, they are skilled labor force. And we are running out of them. Okay, if you look at Singapore, it's really hard to find decent developers. Okay, you can find them here. But within 3 years, as you get more and more startups and more such developers decide to become founders themselves, then you're going to deplete on that pool, and then which means the cost of hiring will actually increase. So and it's a good thing to happen, but within the 3 years, I think it's very important. It's critical to really set a form of benchmark. Further down the line, 5 years, 10 years, it's just going to be great because, now I have 15-year-old guys who are thinking of startups, and they have the opportunity to learn from a lot of, more established startups, and they've got opportunity from first program, the incubators, more and more will be opening up, and startup founders, the more established ones, and there are people that are willing to share their experience, which means the younger startups will actually gain a lot more experience from these people. So yes, definitely a bright spark. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for sharing in our show today.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
In this technology-driven world, countries will lag behind if they fail to change. And Vietnam is determined to transform itself from an electronic component producer into a major runner in this technology race. And Vietnam is now a regional leader in startup investment and sees a lot of startup initiatives. However, laws are needed to be done in order to create a sustainable ecosystem that can nurture and develop startup businesses. And that wraps up our Bizline this week. Thank you very much for being with us. You can always watch us online at vtv4.vn or youtube.com/vtv4go. And from our team here in Hanoi, until next time.